I swore I'd never get another dog after Max died, but then I saw him, shaking, half bald, and staring straight into my soul. That was the first thing I said to the shelter lady when I met Barney. I was just dropping off some old towels and cleaning supplies I didn't need anymore, but I guess life had other plans. Barney wasn't even supposed to be in the lobby. He was curled up in a corner near the front desk, like someone had forgotten he was there. His ribs showed, his breathing sounded like it hurt, and he had these pitiful patches of missing fur. But it was his eyes that stopped me. Those big brown eyes weren't begging. They were waiting. I turned to the girl behind the desk. She had a friendly enough face, freckles, and a badge that said Molly. "Who's that?" I asked, pointing. She followed my finger and sighed. "That's Barney. Came in last week from the highway. Probably dumped. Heartworm positive, skin infections, bad hips. Not much interest. What happens if no one adopts him?" She hesitated. "We try our best, but the medical bills are high and space is limited." I looked back at him. He hadn't moved, not even a twitch, like he already knew how the story usually went. "I'll take him." Molly blinked at me. "Are you sure?" "Yeah. Got nothing but time, a yard, and a second-hand recliner that could use some company." So that's how I ended up driving home with a half-conscious 80-pound mix of who knows what in the back seat of my old Ford. He didn't make a sound, just laid there with his nose pressed to the window like he was afraid to blink. "My name's Carl, by the way. 68, retired construction foreman, divorced, 2 grown kids I hardly see, a bum knee, and a habit of making terrible chili. My place is in rural Missouri, about 2 hours outside St. Louis. I live in the same house my folks left me. It's quiet, got a fenced-in yard, and until a week ago, it had felt too quiet." When we got home, Barney didn't even try to explore. He just lay down on the rug near the heater and closed his eyes. I fixed him a soft bed in the corner with 2 old quilts, put some water near his snout, and left him be. Later, I made him some chicken and rice. Shelter staff said he couldn't handle kibble yet, and he barely managed to eat half. I sat in my recliner that night, watching a baseball rerun with the sound low, listening to his soft wheezes. That sound was oddly comforting. I hadn't realized how empty the place had felt until now. Over the next few days, I started learning his rhythms. He slept most of the time, but every so often he'd lift his head and look around like he was checking to see if he was still alive. I got his meds from the vet, a cocktail of pills I had to sneak into soft cheese or mashed sweet potato. He didn't like being touched, so I moved slow, spoke even slower. By the 4th day, he wagged his tail. Just once, barely noticeable. But it happened when I came in with a blanket warmed in the dryer, and I took that as a win. By the 5th day, he was standing, a little shaky, but determined. He followed me out to the porch and sat at the top step, looking at the woods like he remembered something. We didn't stay out long. The February air still bit pretty hard. It was on the 6th day that he barked. I was in the kitchen, heating up some leftover stew, and I heard it. A single, hoarse bark. I dropped the spoon and rushed into the living room, heart racing. He was standing by the door, tail slowly swaying. "You want to go out?" I asked. He barked again. I opened the door, and he took 2 steps out before his back legs gave a little. I was at his side in a second, helping him balance. We walked together, or rather, hobbled, to the edge of the porch and back. Still, it was the most he'd moved all week. That night, I didn't even turn on the TV. I just sat on the floor near his bed and talked to him. Told him about Max, about my daughter who lives in Oregon, about the time I tried to fix the septic tank myself and nearly flooded the backyard. He didn't understand a word, but he listened. Ears up, head tilted slightly. And when I stopped, he rested his head on my leg. It broke something open in me. I hadn't cried in years, not since Mom passed. But sitting there on the floor, with this broken dog trusting me enough to lean in, I just let it go. Day 7 started like any other. I got up, fed him, gave him his meds, and we sat on the porch for a bit. He seemed stronger that morning, brighter somehow. I joked that he was finally realizing he hit the jackpot. But just before lunch, something strange happened. I was out back, fixing a section of the fence where a branch had fallen. I didn't hear anything unusual at first, just the wind and a few crows. But then Barney let out a growl, low, gravelly, and intense. I turned around fast. There was a man by the side of my property. Tall, scruffy, with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. I didn't recognize him. He hadn't come from the road. Looked like he'd come up through the woods. Barney was between us, fur bristling, his posture low but ready. He looked like a whole different dog. "Hey," I called. "Can I help you?" The guy raised both hands. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you. My car broke down about 2 miles back. Thought I could cut through to the main road." "This isn't the main road." He nodded, taking a slow step back. "My mistake. Didn't mean no harm." "You sure about that?" I asked, glancing at the duffel. He noticed. "Just clothes, man, I swear." Barney didn't stop growling. The guy seemed to think twice. Then he turned and walked back the way he came. I watched until he disappeared into the trees, then looked down at Barney. He was still bristling, but he glanced up at me and let out a soft woof, like he was checking if I was okay. I patted his head. "You've got good instincts, buddy." That evening, I called the sheriff's office just to report it. They said they'd send a car to check the road and look for the guy. I didn't hear anything else, but I slept a little lighter that night. Barney, though, he slept like a log right beside my recliner. First time he'd left his own bed. The next morning, I made us both eggs and toast. He practically inhaled his portion, tail thumping against the floor. I couldn't help but laugh. In just 1 week, that dog had gone from a silent, half-dead lump to the protector of the house. And somehow, in the middle of it all, he'd reminded me what it felt like to matter again. I didn't know it yet, but that week was just the beginning. Barney wasn't just healing. He was planning something I never could have seen coming. And when it happened, it changed everything. 3 days after Barney chased off that stranger, the sheriff called back. "We found the guy," Sheriff Dunlap said, his voice scratchy through the cordless handset I still kept in the kitchen. "Turns out he had warrants in 2 counties, stolen goods in that duffel. Your dog may have stopped a burglary." I looked down at Barney, who was sprawled in the sunbeam that hit the living room rug around 10 each morning. He lifted his head at my voice, ears perked just slightly, as if he knew he was being talked about. "Good boy," I muttered, reaching down to scratch behind his ear. "Guess you earned that leftover roast after all." He thumped his tail once and let out a small huff that sounded halfway between a grunt and a sigh. That same day, I noticed a change. Not just in Barney, but in me. I started waking up a little earlier, cooking more meals instead of grabbing frozen stuff, even trimming back the hedges I'd ignored for years. I didn't talk to many people since retiring, but I found myself calling my neighbor Jim to ask if he had any extra lumber lying around. I wanted to build a better doghouse, something warm and wide enough that Barney could stretch out in comfort if he ever wanted a break from the indoors. Jim brought over a few planks, and we set up shop in my garage that weekend. Barney sat on the porch the whole time, supervising. "He's got the eyes of an old soul," Jim said, watching him. "Feels like he's been here longer than a week, don't it?" Jim nodded. "That dog picked you, not the other way around." That stuck with me. because it felt true. From the second our eyes met in that shelter, it was like some quiet agreement had been made, like we were both broken in ways that matched. Barney's energy improved more with each passing day. The antibiotics were helping, and the heartworm treatment plan was underway. He started putting on weight, too. By the end of the second week, the sunken look around his eyes had started to fade. He had this lumbering walk, like every step took thought. But when he got excited, usually around mealtime, he'd do this little hop that made me laugh every time. One evening, I sat out on the porch with a blanket draped over my lap and a mug of tea in my hand. Barney lay beside me, his chin resting on my boot. "You know," I said, "I thought I was done. I figured the best parts of life had already happened. I'd had my career, raised my kids, watched too many friends move on. But now I get up in the morning and think about your breakfast, about getting that ramp built by the back steps for your hips, and it feels good to care again." He didn't move, but his eyes opened slowly, and his tail brushed the porch once. The next morning, the local paper left a voicemail. "Hi, this is Karen with the Monroe County Gazette. We heard from Sheriff Dunlap about your dog, Barney. We'd love to do a little feature story if you're willing. Human interest, you know. Just a short write-up and maybe a picture or two. Let us know." I almost deleted the message. I wasn't much for attention, and Barney sure wasn't the parading around type. But then I thought, maybe someone else needs to see a story like his. Maybe there's another man out there who just lost his dog, or someone who thinks they've run out of reasons to wake up in the morning. So I called her back. Karen came by 2 days later. She was young, probably fresh out of college, wearing a scarf and big glasses that kept sliding down her nose. But she was kind. She brought a Polaroid-style camera and a notebook and sat on the floor to be closer to Barney's level. "He's very stoic," she said, as he sat beside me, looking unimpressed. "He'll warm up to you. Just give him a minute." It only took a few head scratches and a slice of turkey before Barney leaned into her. She smiled wide and started snapping photos. "So," she asked, "why him? Out of all the dogs?" I looked down at Barney. His coat was still patchy, but you could see the soft gold coming in around his neck. His scars, though faded, still peeked through. Because no one else would. And because I saw something in him. Maybe the same thing I lost in myself for a while. She wrote that down. The story ran the following Tuesday. It was a small column, bottom of the lifestyle page, but the photo of Barney got a lot of attention. Folks at the grocery store stopped me to ask how he was doing. One lady even sent a bag of homemade dog treats in a box wrapped with paw print ribbon. Barney didn't care about the fame, of course, but he liked the treats. It was around this time that I decided to start taking him out more. I figured some sunshine and fresh air might do us both some good. We started small, 10-minute walks down our dirt road, then a little longer the next day. Barney still had a limp, and he tired easily, but he walked with purpose. One afternoon, we made it all the way to the creek that runs through the edge of my property. There's a little wooden bridge there, built years ago when my kids were still young enough to play in the water. I hadn't been down there in ages. Barney sniffed the air, then stepped slowly onto the bridge. He paused halfway, looked out over the shallow stream, then sat. I sat beside him. Used to bring Max down here. He'd chase frogs, roll in the mud. Drove me nuts sometimes. But man, I miss those days. Barney nudged my elbow with his nose. You don't have to fill his shoes, you know. You're not Max. But I'm real glad you're here. He rested his head on my knee, and we stayed that way for a long time. The sound of water trickling and birds calling in the trees around us. That night, he dreamed. I could tell by the way his legs twitched and the muffled woofs that escaped him. I liked watching him sleep. There was peace in it. A few days later, I woke up to a noise. Not the usual creak of the house settling, but something sharper. A rustling. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the kitchen. Barney was already up, standing alert by the back door. He gave me a quick glance, then back to the window. I flipped on the outside light. Nothing. But Barney wasn't convinced. He paced once, circled the door, then barked. Just once. I opened the door and stepped out onto the deck. The cold air hit me quick. Barney followed close behind. Then I saw it. A raccoon, fat and bold, had knocked over my trash can. It scurried off as soon as the light hit it. Barney stood there a moment longer, then looked up at me like, "See? Told you. All right, detective. Let's get you back to bed." He trotted inside like it was his job well done. The next week, Jim came by again, this time with a sack of dog food and a box of tennis balls. Figured he could use a few toys. Barney sniffed the box with mild interest, then plucked out one ball and wandered to the porch to chew on it. Jim leaned on the porch railing. "You know, Carl, you look younger than you did 6 months ago. You saying I looked terrible before?" "No, just looked tired. Now you look like a man who's got something to do." He was right. I didn't realize how routine my days had become before Barney. Wake up, coffee, stare out the window, maybe nap, maybe watch TV. Now I had meds to give, meals to prepare, vet appointments to schedule, walks to take. And most of all, I had company. Even on the quietest days, Barney filled the silence. One evening, the wind picked up and brought a cold snap. I set up the space heater near his bed and tucked another blanket over him. As I stood, he looked up and gave a short bark. "What? You want to sleep in the bedroom tonight?" He wagged his tail. So I moved his bed into my room, right by the window. That night I fell asleep to the sound of his breathing, slow and even. A storm came through the next day. Thunder, lightning, the whole show. I found Barney under the kitchen table, shaking. "Hey, it's all right. You're safe here." I crouched beside him, one hand resting gently on his shoulder until he stopped trembling. We sat there until the worst passed. And that's how it was. We were learning each other's fears, building a language of gestures and glances. He knew when I needed quiet. I knew when he needed reassurance. 2 days later, the shelter called. "Mr. Turner, this is Molly from the shelter. I just wanted you to know. You've started something. Since your story ran, we've had 3 of our longest-staying dogs adopted. People say they want a Barney." I smiled. That's the best news I've heard all week. After I hung up, I looked at Barney. "You're a trendsetter now, huh?" He barked. I didn't know what the next week would bring, but for the first time in years, I was looking forward to finding out. Barney and we had plans to make. Barney had always been a quiet dog. Not timid exactly, but watchful. Like he was carrying something inside he didn't know how to put down yet. It reminded me of old veterans I'd worked with back in construction, men who'd seen things they never talked about but carried the weight in their shoulders anyway. By the 3rd week, his physical recovery was undeniable. His coat was growing in better, thicker around the neck and chest. He still had a few scars, and he'd probably always have a limp, but that limp didn't slow him down when he saw a squirrel dart across the yard. He didn't chase it, just followed it with those laser-sharp eyes, like he was keeping track of things that mattered only to him. I started taking him into town more. I figured a little socializing might help him, and maybe me too. The feed store became our usual spot, mostly because it was dog-friendly, and Mr. Hadley, who ran the place, always had biscuits behind the counter. Barney didn't take to strangers fast, but Hadley won him over with a slow approach and a few kind words. "He's got that smart look," Hadley said, leaning down to offer another treat. "Not just smart, I mean wise, like he knows what matters." "He knows more than me some days," I said, rubbing Barney behind the ear. Outside the store, a woman stopped us. She looked to be in her 70s, wearing a heavy wool coat and pushing a shopping cart filled with yarn and soup cans. "Is that the dog from the paper?" I nodded. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "That story, it gave me hope. I lost my own dog last year. It's been hard, but your story made me think maybe I could open my home again." She smiled at Barney, and for once, he stepped toward a stranger without hesitation. She bent down slowly, and he leaned into her. "Thank you," she said again, but this time to him. On the way home, I looked at him in the rearview mirror. He'd fallen asleep, head resting on the armrest, breathing slow and peaceful. "You're doing more good than I ever did with a hammer in my hand," I said. That night, I took out an old photo album. It had been collecting dust on a shelf in the guest bedroom for years. I flipped through it while Barney lay nearby, his tail flicking every time I laughed at an old picture. There was one of Max as a pup, muddy paws on my chest, tongue hanging out like he owned the world. There were pictures of the kids when they were small, and even one of me and my ex-wife at our wedding, back when everything felt easier. I don't know why I pulled that book out. Maybe because Barney had made this house feel full again, and I wanted to remember what that fullness used to look like. Later that week, we went to the vet for his monthly checkup. Dr. Raines had a calming voice, the kind that always made animals relax. Barney sat still while she checked his heart, lungs, joints. "He's healing beautifully," she said, scribbling notes. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." I smiled. "Just feeding him and keeping him warm. And giving him purpose," she added. "Dogs know when they're loved. It makes all the difference." We left with a few refills on his meds and a treat from the receptionist. Barney carried it in his mouth all the way to the truck. That afternoon, I worked on the backyard. There was a section by the oak tree that had always been uneven. I brought out a rake and started clearing it. Barney lay nearby, watching. After about 20 minutes, I realized he'd moved a little closer, then a little more. Eventually, he was right beside me, pawing at the ground like he was helping. "You want to be my foreman, huh?" He sat, panting lightly, and barked once. "You're hired. No pay, though. Just biscuits." We kept at it for an hour, just the two of us moving dirt and raking until the patch looked halfway decent. I couldn't stop smiling. One morning, about a month after bringing him home, I got a letter in the mail. It was from the shelter. "Dear Mr. Turner, we wanted to thank you again for adopting Barney. His story has inspired more adoptions than any we've seen in recent years. Enclosed are a few letters from families who wanted to share what your story meant to them. Sincerely, Molly and the shelter team." There were 5 handwritten letters inside. One from a man who'd lost his wife and adopted an old bulldog. Another from a single mother who found a bond between her son and their new rescue that she never thought possible. Each one mentioned Barney. I read every word, then read them again. I placed them in the same album with Max's pictures and our family photos. The next week, something strange happened. Barney stopped eating. At first, I thought maybe it was just a bad day. He sniffed his bowl and walked away. The next morning, same thing. No vomiting, no diarrhea, just no appetite. I tried different food, warmed up broth, even scrambled eggs. He took a few bites, but nothing stuck. I called Dr. Rains. "Bring him in," she said. "Let's not wait." The exam took longer than usual. They drew blood, checked his gums, took x-rays. I sat in the waiting room, bouncing my knee and trying not to imagine worst-case scenarios. When she came back, her face was serious, but not panicked. "There's some inflammation in the digestive tract," she said. "Could be related to his heartworm meds or just a reaction to something he ate. We'll adjust the treatment plan, add a stomach protectant, and monitor him." She looked me in the eye. "We caught it early." That night, he slept curled tightly against my recliner, his breathing slower than usual. I barely slept at all. Every sound had me checking if he was okay. Over the next few days, he improved. Little by little, he ate more. The sparkle in his eyes returned. But it reminded me just how fragile this thing was, this quiet joy we'd built together. I decided we needed an adventure. So the next weekend, I packed us a bag, snacks, water, a blanket, and we drove to the state park an hour out of town. It had wide trails and grassy clearings where he could lie down when he got tired. We walked slow, taking in the smell of pine and dirt. Barney trotted beside me, tail wagging, nose working overtime. At one point, we found a bench near a clearing. I sat, and he lay in the grass beside me. The breeze rustled the leaves. A few kids played nearby, their laughter echoing through the trees. "You like this, huh?" I asked. He rolled onto his back, legs in the air, tongue flopping out. "That's a yes." We stayed until the sun dipped low. Driving home, he rested his head on my shoulder from the back seat, just barely reaching me. I didn't mind. My shoulder had been empty for a long time. The following week, we started a new routine. After breakfast, we'd sit by the window in the living room and watch the world. Sometimes birds, sometimes the neighbor's cat, sometimes nothing at all. Just the two of us, listening to the wind. One afternoon, I caught myself humming. I hadn't done that in years. Not since my son moved out and the house got quiet. Not since Max passed. Barney looked up, ears twitching. "Don't worry," I told him. "I won't sing." He barked softly. And then one day, it snowed. Not the harsh, icy kind we get in January, but the light, fluffy kind that makes everything feel clean. Barney stared at it like he didn't trust it at first. Then he walked outside and stepped into a patch of snow like he was testing it. Moments later, he started hopping through the drifts, kicking up powder and snapping at the flakes. I hadn't seen that kind of playfulness in him before. I grabbed my phone and took a few pictures. Later that night, I printed one out and pinned it to the fridge. It was a simple shot. Barney mid-leap, mouth open, tail flying behind him like a banner. Pure joy. And for the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a place I was waiting to leave. It felt like home again. Not just because of him, but because of who I got to be around him. And neither of us was finished yet. It was sometime in mid-March when I noticed Barney doing something new. Every morning, just after breakfast, he would walk over to the front door and sit down facing it, waiting. Not whining, not scratching, just sitting there like he had an appointment. I watched him for a few days to see if maybe there was some pattern. Maybe he was hearing the mailman or the school bus from the road. But the timing didn't line up. On the fourth morning, I opened the door for him. He stood, stretched, then walked to the edge of the porch and looked down the gravel driveway. Nothing there. Still, he sat and waited. "Expecting someone?" I asked, sipping my coffee. He didn't look back, just kept his gaze fixed forward, like he was remembering something only he could see. That's when it hit me. Maybe he wasn't expecting someone. Maybe he was making sure no one unexpected showed up. The memory of that guy from the woods came back. Even now, it unsettled me. Maybe Barney still felt like it was his job to keep watch. Even if he didn't trust the quiet, he was making peace with it on his own terms. I sat beside him for a while, just the two of us listening to birds. When he finally stood and went back inside, I followed. It was like clockwork after that. Morning patrol, porch duty, then back to the couch for a nap. Meanwhile, our walks were getting longer. The weather had warmed just enough to make the creek trail comfortable again. He'd lead the way, tail swaying, ears bouncing with each step. I swear he knew the best spots to stop and listen to the water. One afternoon, I brought a thermos and sat on the bench while Barney lay near the edge of the creek, nose twitching at the breeze. There was a kind of stillness in the moment that made time feel like it folded in on itself. No chores, no bills, no news, just a dog and his person, enjoying the simplicity of being somewhere without needing to be anywhere else. I started bringing a notebook with me on our outings. Not to write anything important, just thoughts, little observations. Things I used to let slip away. Barney seemed to like when I read them aloud. He'd tilt his head, and I'd pretend he understood every word. Here's one I wrote that day. Today the creek moved slower than usual. Barney didn't chase anything. He just listened. I think I'm learning how to do the same. One evening, my daughter called. That was rare. We talked a few times a year, usually around birthdays and holidays. "Hey, Dad," she said, sounding distracted. "I saw the article about Barney. A friend sent it to me." I didn't know what to say. It had been years since we'd had a real conversation. Her life was in Oregon now. She was busy raising kids, managing a business. I didn't blame her for the distance, but it was there all the same. "Yeah," I said. "He's made quite the splash around here. I just wanted to say I'm glad you have him. You sound different. Happier." I looked over at Barney, curled on the rug with his legs in the air and his lips flopped open. "Yeah, I think I am." We talked for 20 minutes, the most we'd spoken in a decade without awkward pauses. She asked about his health, about how I was handling things. She said maybe she'd come visit in the summer. I hung up feeling something I hadn't felt in a while. Connected. A few days later, the shelter called again. "Mr. Turner, sorry to bother you, but we had an emergency intake today," Molly said. "It's a little rough. Older dog. Some similar issues to Barney. We're at capacity, and well, we thought of you." I looked at Barney. He was by the window again, watching squirrels like they owed him money. "Let me come meet him," I said. His name was Rusty. A 10-year-old hound mix with cloudy eyes and ears like a floppy hat. He was smaller than Barney, but stockier, with a cautious gait and a deep, almost musical bark. He'd been found tied to a fence behind a gas station. I didn't hesitate. I signed the papers and brought him home that afternoon. Barney didn't bark when Rusty walked in. He stood still, nose twitching, watching every step. Then, after a moment, he walked over and sniffed Rusty's ear. Rusty let out a low whine and pressed his head gently into Barney's side. They didn't need me to explain anything. They understood each other right away. The first few days were quiet. Rusty mostly slept. Barney stayed close, never hovering, just nearby. They'd nap in the same room, walk side by side. If one stood up, the other followed. I had 2 dog beds, but they always ended up in one by morning. It changed the rhythm of the house in a good way. Meal times took longer, walks were a little slower, but the place felt alive in a way I didn't know it could. One morning, I took both of them to the creek. Rusty moved carefully, each step measured. When we reached the water, Barney waded in just a bit and looked back, like inviting Rusty to follow. Rusty hesitated, then stepped into the shallows. They stood there side by side, water lapping at their legs, and I felt something in my chest that made me stop breathing for a second. Peace, maybe. Or hope. Back at home, I started adjusting the yard, added a few ramps for Rusty's joints, spread out the beds a bit more, reorganized the kitchen to make feeding smoother. It gave me purpose. I liked the feeling of having someone rely on me again. Jim stopped by to drop off more tennis balls and a new leash he found on sale. "You starting a retirement home for dogs?" he joked. "Maybe," I said. "Not a bad way to go." One rainy afternoon, I was reading by the window when I looked up and saw both dogs staring out at the yard. Nothing moved out there, but they sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. "What do you two know that I don't?" They didn't look back, just stayed like that, statues in fur. Eventually, they wandered off to nap again, but it reminded me how animals seem to feel the world in ways we forget to. That night, I pulled out my notebook. Barney and Rusty remind me that life doesn't end when you get old. It just changes speed. And if you're lucky, you get to slow down with someone who understands the quiet. The next day brought snow again. This time, Rusty joined in the fun. Barney showed him how to catch snowflakes, how to leap without slipping. They rolled in the snow like they'd been waiting their whole lives for it. I got another picture. This one of the two of them standing side by side, covered in snow, eyes squinting like they were smiling. I printed that one too. Barney had been in my life for less than 2 months, and already he'd brought more color, more movement, more meaning than anything in the last decade. And now Rusty had added to that in ways I didn't see coming. I wasn't sure what would come next. But for the first time in a long while, I looked forward to it. There was more to build, more to give, and more quiet mornings to share with two old souls who understood what it meant to keep going, no matter what you'd already lost. And somehow, without trying, they were helping me remember that too. Barney had a way of making the days feel longer in the best kind of way. Now that Rusty was with us, the house had taken on a rhythm, almost like music. Mornings were for slow walks and careful stretches, afternoons for naps in shifting sunbeams, and evenings for the sound of 2 sets of paws tapping across the floor as dinner was prepared. By the 5th week, Rusty had come into his own. He was still cautious, still slower than Barney, but he started showing bits of personality that had been buried under fear and confusion when he first arrived. I noticed the way he'd carry one particular slipper to his bed. Never chewed, just held gently. He'd steal glances at me while I read, and if I met his eyes, his tail would twitch once, as if that's all the energy he could give. But it meant everything. Barney, on the other hand, had become something like a big brother. He didn't nudge or push, didn't bark or demand attention. But whenever Rusty seemed unsure, Barney would lead. Whether it was stepping out onto the icy porch or climbing into the back seat of the truck, Barney would go first, pause, and wait, like he was saying, "You're not alone. I've got you." It changed how I thought about recovery. I'd always believed healing was something you did by yourself. Time, space, maybe a few kind words. But watching those two, I realized healing also meant having someone beside you who understood. Not perfectly, but deeply. One chilly morning, I got a call from the church I used to attend. I hadn't been in a while, not since before Max passed. But Pastor Rick had heard about Barney and wanted to know if I'd consider bringing him in for the monthly community day. It was a little event they did where folks brought donated clothes and food for those in need. They also invited therapy animals when they could. "He's not certified or anything," I said. "He's just Barney." "Sometimes that's all folks need," Rick said. "Just a dog who's been through it and came out the other side." I agreed, a little nervous about how he'd handle a crowd. But when the day came, Barney surprised me again. I put a red bandana around his neck, and he sat like a statue while I adjusted it. Rusty stayed home with a marrow bone and a blanket warmed in the dryer. The church gym was full of people, tables stacked with canned goods, piles of jackets, a few kids running between the legs of folding chairs. Barney walked beside me like he'd done it all before. People smiled as we passed. Some reached out to touch him, and I watched how gentle he was, how patient. An older man in a heavy coat sat near the back with his arms crossed tight. He looked like he didn't want to be there. Barney saw him, broke from my side, and walked straight over. He stopped a foot away and sat. Just sat. The man looked down, then away, then back. Slowly, one hand reached out. Barney leaned into it. "Had a dog once," the man said after a long silence. "Before I lost my place." Barney didn't move. He just stayed close, breathing slow and steady. When I looked over 10 minutes later, the man was still petting him. Something about that moment stuck with me. Sometimes healing meant showing up for someone else, not just yourself. Back home, Rusty was waiting by the door. When I opened it, he let out a soft whine and walked in circles until Barney sniffed him head to tail like he was checking for changes. "I didn't trade him in," I said. "Just borrowed him for a bit." That night, I made roasted chicken and sweet potatoes. Barney and Rusty each got a plate. I watched as they ate side by side, tails swaying gently. It was one of those moments you want to bottle up forever. Later in the week, I brought out some of the old camping gear from the garage. I'd stopped using it after my knee gave me trouble, but now I was wondering if we could manage a weekend up at the lake. It wasn't far, and the spot I used to go to had a wide clearing and an easy trail down to the water. I sat on the floor and inspected everything: the pop-up tent, the thermal mats, the old lantern that still smelled faintly of kerosene. Barney walked over and nudged the rolled-up sleeping bag. Rusty sat by the door, ears perked. "You boys up for an adventure?" I spent the next few days making sure everything still worked, packing enough food and meds for both of them, and even borrowing a friend's truck with a camper shell to keep them warm on the ride. When Friday came, we set off just after lunch. The drive was smooth. Barney sat up front with his chin on the dashboard, eyes scanning the road. Rusty lay curled in the back, snoring softly. When we reached the lake, I parked close to the trailhead and walked them both down to the clearing. The lake shimmered, untouched by the wind, surrounded by bare trees that whispered quietly when the breeze picked up. It felt like stepping into a memory I hadn't known I missed. I set up the tent slowly, careful of my knee, but the boys waited nearby, watching, not wandering. When everything was ready, I laid out the mats and blankets and built a small fire in the stone ring that had survived winters since before I was born. That night, we sat around the fire. I shared pieces of jerky, and they listened to the crackle of the flames like it was the most natural place in the world for 3 worn souls to be. I slept lightly, not used to the cold anymore, but every time I stirred, one or the other was there, pressed close, breathing quietly. We were a strange little pack, but it worked. The next morning, I woke to the sound of geese on the water and the smell of frost in the air. Barney was already sitting outside the tent, watching the mist rise off the lake. Rusty emerged a minute later, shook himself, and joined him. I made coffee and oatmeal over the fire. We stayed another day, exploring the trail a little, resting often, moving slow. I wrote in the notebook again. Some days you carry the weight, some days it carries you. Today it felt lighter. When we got home, the house felt warmer somehow, familiar. Barney walked the perimeter like he always did, making sure everything was as we left it. Rusty found his spot on the rug, exhaled deeply, and closed his eyes. Spring was coming. You could smell it in the air. And I found myself planning again. Not big things, just little improvements. Maybe a new coat of paint on the porch swing. Maybe a raised bed for herbs. Jim stopped by to drop off extra wood and stayed for stew. "You're not just living, Carl," he said, spoon halfway to his mouth. "You're building something again." I thought about that for a long time after he left. That night, as the dogs snored on either side of me, I wrote one last line. I think they saved me before I even knew I needed saving. Then I closed the notebook and turned out the light, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. Because with them, tomorrow was something to look forward to. The air smelled different by the second week of April. Warmer, fuller, like the earth had rolled over in its sleep and decided to start waking up. I was out on the back porch early one morning, coffee in hand, watching as Barney stood in the grass, sniffing the wind like it carried a message just for him. Rusty was curled in the patch of sunlight near the shed, dozing with his chin on his paws. It had become part of our rhythm. Wake up, stretch, patrol the yard. Some people read the newspaper in the morning. I had the dogs. I'd always thought spring was a young man's season, something about the way everything starts over, the green pushing through dirt, the birds showing off in trees. But now, with Barney and Rusty moving slowly through the yard, watching the bees like philosophers, I realized maybe spring is for anyone willing to pay attention. Anyone patient enough to see it happen one leaf at a time. I started clearing out the old garden bed by the fence. It had gone to seed years ago, overrun with weeds and dead vines. But something about watching the dogs rediscover the yard made me want to give it new life. I knelt there most afternoons, pulling weeds, turning soil, feeling the sun on the back of my neck. Barney would lay nearby, keeping an eye on me like he wasn't quite sure I knew what I was doing. Rusty preferred the shade, but he'd wander over and sniff the overturned dirt, then walk away satisfied. One afternoon, I found an unopened packet of marigold seeds in the shed, left over from who knows when, and decided to scatter them. I didn't know if they'd sprout, but it felt like a promise, a little wager on the future. The town had started inviting us to more events. After our visit to the community day at the church, Pastor Rick put in a word at the senior center. They had a monthly gathering called Coffee and Company, where folks came to sit, talk, and listen to whatever entertainment was lined up. This time, they wanted Barney. "You sure he's up for another appearance?" I asked. "He's not exactly a stage performer." "He doesn't have to be," Rick said. "He just has to be there. That's the magic." So I brought him. Rusty stayed home again. He didn't like long car rides, and I didn't want to push him. Barney climbed into the truck with no coaxing, sat up straight the whole drive. The senior center was brighter than I remembered, windows wide open to let in the spring breeze. The folks gathered around in a semicircle of folding chairs and card tables. Some used walkers, some leaned heavily on canes, but every single one of them smiled when Barney walked in wearing his red bandana. I talked a little about how we met, about his time at the shelter and how he'd changed my life. Barney did the rest. He walked from person to person, giving each of them his quiet attention. One woman whispered to him for a solid 5 minutes. Another held his face in her hands and just closed her eyes. "He reminds me of my husband," she said, laughing at herself. "Strong and quiet, always listening." Afterward, they gave us a little thank you basket, homemade cookies, a knitted scarf, and a note that read, "Thank you for reminding us that love doesn't age." Back home, Rusty was waiting on the porch. Barney hopped down from the truck, and they touched noses like they hadn't seen each other in weeks. It made my throat tighten. That night, I took out my notebook again. Barney has a way of pulling the truth out of people, not by speaking, but by being. He doesn't fix things. He just makes the hard stuff easier to carry. Around the middle of the month, I got a surprise in the mail, a letter from my son. He'd always been the quieter of my 2 kids. Moved to Colorado after college, took a job in outdoor gear design, and didn't write much beyond the usual Christmas card. The letter was 3 pages long. He wrote about how he'd seen the article from the Monroe Gazette, then read a follow-up someone had posted on social media. He said it made him think about me, about how we used to camp when he was a boy, how I'd taught him to fish, and how to make a fire in the rain. "I guess I forgot you were still teaching," he wrote. "Just in a different way now." He ended the letter by saying he was planning a trip out east in the summer, and maybe he could swing by Missouri. I read that last paragraph 5 times. Then I folded the letter and placed it next to the notebook on the coffee table. The next morning, I took the boys to the vet for their checkups. Dr. Raines greeted Barney like an old friend and gave Rusty extra time since he was still adjusting to the routine. She said both were doing remarkably well, especially considering where they'd started. "Whatever you're doing," she said, "keep it up." I looked down at the 2 of them sitting side by side, patiently waiting. I think they're the ones keeping me up. Later that week, Jim helped me install a new ramp from the porch to the yard. Rusty was starting to hesitate at the steps, and I didn't want him to struggle. We built it wide and gentle, with traction mats for grip. As soon as we finished, Rusty walked up and down it 3 times, tail wagging like he was proud of himself. "That's one happy customer," Jim said. Barney followed behind, slower, more deliberate, as if he were inspecting the craftsmanship. I grilled steaks that night. The dogs got their own, cut into bite-sized pieces and served on old china plates I'd never found a use for. We ate outside, the 3 of us, under a sky slowly fading into dusk. The garden started showing signs of life the next morning, just tiny green shoots, barely visible unless you looked close. I knelt in the dirt and brushed soil back from one with the tip of my finger. "Told you it wasn't a waste," I said to Barney, who stood over me like a supervisor. Rusty sniffed the air and sneezed. "That's approval, I think," I said. A few days later, Molly from the shelter called again. "We're putting together a calendar fundraiser," she said. 12 dogs, 1 for each month, all with stories like Barney and Rusty. Would you let us feature them?" "Only if I don't have to pose. Just the dogs, I promise." She came by the next week with a professional photographer in tow. The man brought a squeaky toy, a big camera, and a calm energy that made both dogs relax instantly. We went down to the creek for the shoot. Barney stood in the shallow water, Rusty beside him, both of them looking out over the surface like they were remembering something older than either of us. The photographer captured the moment just right. I saw the image later in his preview folder, a stillness so full it almost made you feel like you were there. I didn't know what month they'd be, but I hoped it would be April. Back home, I put on a record, an old jazz album I hadn't touched in years. The notes drifted through the house, soft and warm. Rusty fell asleep near the speaker, and Barney lay with his head on my foot. I reached for my notebook and wrote, "Maybe the trick to feeling young again isn't pretending nothing changed. Maybe it's sharing your quiet with someone who knows how to listen." The marigolds sprouted higher the next day. And the days kept coming, one full breath at a time. By the time May rolled around, the marigolds had begun to bloom in earnest. Bright orange bursts rising from the dark soil, just like I hoped they would. Barney sniffed each flower like it was something sacred. And Rusty, well, he tried to eat one, then sneezed and gave me a look like it was the flower's fault. Every morning we checked the garden together. I'd talk to them both like they were part of a team effort, giving status reports on which stalks had grown and which needed more water. Sometimes I'd catch myself using phrases like, "Looks like we'll have to reinforce the eastern perimeter," and laugh at the absurdity. But it made sense in the context of our little world. Jim started coming by more often, said he had some leftover wood from a porch project, and asked if I wanted to build planter boxes. I didn't have to think long. We spent 3 afternoons hammering and sawing, with Barney keeping watch, and Rusty dozing in the shade like an old man who knew better than to volunteer for physical labor. At the end of it, we had 3 raised beds lined along the fence, 2 for vegetables, 1 for herbs. I planted tomatoes, beans, cucumbers, basil, and parsley. It had been over a decade since I'd tried growing anything that couldn't survive on its own, but I felt confident with the dogs nearby. "You're good luck," I told them. "That's why things grow." Barney wagged his tail. Rusty blinked slowly like he was soaking it all in. Mid-May brought longer days and more light in the evenings. I started leaving the windows open until bedtime, letting the breeze carry the smell of lilacs into the house. Some nights I played soft music on the old stereo, and other nights we just sat in silence, the 3 of us, sharing space without needing to fill it. One evening, I got a call from a woman named Andrea. She said she ran a program at the local middle school, a mentorship initiative that matched kids with adult volunteers for once-a-week hangouts. Nothing formal, just conversation, maybe a walk, sometimes a little help with homework. "We're not asking for tutoring," she said. "Just presence. You've got the kind of presence that sticks." "And dogs are allowed?" "They're encouraged. Some of these kids trust animals more than people." That part, I understood. So the next Thursday, I drove to the school with Barney and Rusty in the back of the truck. Barney wore his red bandana. Rusty had a new blue one I'd picked up at the feed store. They both looked like they were heading into a photo shoot. The school was a squat, red brick building with a long sidewalk leading to a community room on the side. Inside, kids sat at folding tables, working on puzzles, drawing, playing quiet card games. A few adults stood around chatting, and when we walked in, everything paused for a second. Then someone whispered, "It's them. That's the dogs from the story." A boy named Ethan was assigned to us. He was small for his age, wore glasses, and didn't say much at first. He looked at the dogs, not me, and asked, "Do they bite?" "Only their food, and sometimes each other's tails, but only by accident." He reached out slowly to pet Barney. Barney leaned in with a sigh, the way he always did when someone needed reassurance. Rusty sat at Ethan's feet and didn't move. We spent the next hour walking laps around the schoolyard, Ethan talking more and more with each circuit. He told me he liked drawing cars, that his mom worked nights, and that his favorite food was breakfast sandwiches with too much cheese. "Do you think dogs understand when we talk?" he asked. "I think they understand what matters. Not always the words, but the feeling behind them." Ethan nodded, then leaned down and whispered something into Rusty's ear. I didn't catch the words. Rusty blinked slowly and leaned his head against Ethan's leg. After that first visit, we came every Thursday. The kids began calling Barney the mayor because he made the rounds like a politician, while Rusty became the designated reading companion. They'd sit with him on the beanbag chairs. books in their laps, reading out loud as he snored gently beside them. One of the teachers snapped a photo of a girl reading to Rusty with her head resting on his shoulder. She emailed it to me with the subject line, "Pure peace." Back at home, our garden grew fast. The tomatoes flowered, the cucumbers began to stretch across the trellis Jim helped install, and every evening I picked a few herbs to use with dinner. The dogs loved the smell of fresh basil and parsley. Rusty still tried to eat the marigolds, but I'd gently redirect him with a slice of carrot. I started experimenting more in the kitchen. Nothing fancy, just small changes. Roasted sweet potatoes with thyme, grilled zucchini with lemon. The dogs always got a taste. Sometimes I'd cook a little extra just for them. One Saturday morning, I woke up early to the sound of rain and decided it was the perfect day for pancakes. I hadn't made them from scratch in years, but something about the cool air and the slow patter of water on the roof made me want to try. Barney and Rusty watched the process from their usual spots in the kitchen. Barney closest to the stove, Rusty near the pantry where the treats were kept. I mixed flour, eggs, milk, and a pinch of cinnamon. As the first pancake sizzled on the griddle, I looked over and said, "I think we're doing okay, boys. Better than okay." Barney thumped his tail twice. Rusty licked his lips in anticipation. We ate breakfast on the porch, the three of us watching the rain paint little silver trails on the deck. I brought out a blanket for the bench and let the dogs rest their heads on my legs as I drank coffee and let the world move slow around us. A few days later, I got another letter. This one from a woman who said she'd lost her husband last year and couldn't bear the silence in the house. She read about Barney and Rusty and adopted an old shepherd mix named Hank from a rescue 2 towns over. "I wake up to snoring again," she wrote, "and I never thought I'd be so grateful for that sound." I pinned her letter on the fridge next to the photo of the girl reading to Rusty. Jim came by again, this time with a folding table and a puzzle box. "Thought you might like a challenge that doesn't involve dirt." We set up the table in the den, spread out the pieces, and got to work. The dogs lay nearby, occasionally getting up to investigate a particularly noisy bit of progress. It became our new weekend tradition. Puzzles, coffee, and occasional shouting when we couldn't find the edge pieces. June crept closer, and the days grew long. I found myself staying up later, sitting outside while the fireflies blinked through the grass. Barney always settled beside me, head high, scanning the dark like he was guarding a castle. Rusty would sit on the step below, leaning into my leg. One night, as the stars came out, I reached for my notebook again. You don't always know the moment your life changes. Sometimes it starts with a soft sigh, a slow blink, a paw resting on your boot. You just wake up one day and realize you're not alone anymore. I read that line out loud. Barney looked up, then closed his eyes again. Rusty snored. We sat like that for a long while, listening to the sounds of a world we were finally part of again. June arrived with heat and dust, and the kind of sunlight that made every blade of grass seem sharper. The marigolds were in full bloom now, radiant and loud against the quiet of the yard. Barney had taken to lying in the shade of the raised beds, while Rusty preferred the cool tile of the kitchen. I couldn't blame him. The afternoons were too hot for much else. Most mornings started the same way, me at the sink pouring water into the kettle, Barney watching the back door like he was waiting for a signal, and Rusty stretched out near the table, tail thumping softly against the floor in response to nothing at all. I liked that about him. Rusty didn't need a reason to be content. He just was. Our Thursday school visits had ended for the season, the kids gone on summer break, but Ethan had written me a note on the last day. It was short. Just one sentence. "Thank you for showing me what calm looks like." It sat folded on the windowsill now, right above the sink where I could glance at it during dishes or while prepping dinner. Sometimes I'd whisper it back to myself. What calm looks like. If you'd told me a year ago that calm could be found in 2 dogs and a patch of vegetables, I'd have laughed. But here I was. The tomatoes came in first. Small ones, bright red and sweet. I picked the first batch while the dogs supervised and brought them inside like I was holding treasure. I washed them carefully, cut one open, and gave each of the boys a slice. Barney licked his plate clean. Rusty took his time, as always, chewing with a slow, thoughtful expression, like he was considering its place in the universe. That weekend, Jim and I went into town for supplies. The hardware store had a summer sale, and I had my eye on a screen door to replace the busted old one that slapped in the wind. We drove his truck, and I picked up 2 bags of mulch, a replacement hose, and a wind chime shaped like a rowboat that I hadn't needed but couldn't resist. While we were loading up, Jim glanced over and said, "You ever think about writing a book?" "What for?" "You've already been writing in that notebook. You've got stories now, real ones. People would read them." I shrugged. "They're just for me. All the best ones start that way." He had a point, but I didn't say anything else. On the ride home, we talked about the new fire station being built, the price of lumber, and whether or not that diner off Route 5 was worth trying again. When I got home, Barney was on the porch, tongue out, tail wagging. Rusty followed behind him with a slow limp and a deep yawn. I gave each of them a biscuit and set up the new wind chime on the corner of the porch. That evening, when the breeze picked up, it let out a soft, lazy sound, like an old song played on a worn piano. The days turned slower with the heat. We started going on walks at dawn instead of late afternoon. I'd carry a thermos of coffee and watch the sun rise through the trees while Barney led us down the trail, nose low, tail steady. Rusty followed behind, pausing often to sniff every stump and patch of dirt, like each one told a story he didn't want to miss. One morning we found a turtle flipped on its back at the edge of the road. Barney sat down beside it and barked once. Rusty sniffed it, then looked at me like it was my turn. I picked it up gently and carried it to the other side of the ditch, placing it near the creek where the grass was thick. "You two got me out here playing guardian angel," I said. They didn't respond, but both sat watching the turtle disappear slowly into the green. That night I wrote, "Sometimes peace comes disguised as routine. A bowl of water, a breeze on your neck, a turtle finding its way back to the shade." By mid-month, I noticed Barney slowing down. Nothing dramatic, just a little more time getting up from his bed, a little more stiffness after a nap. I adjusted his walk times, added a few more joint supplements to his meals, and kept the fan running in the living room for him. He never complained, never made a sound, just moved a little slower, but always with purpose. Rusty stuck close to him. They'd nap side by side, noses touching. If Barney stood, Rusty stood. If Barney limped, Rusty walked beside him like a quiet shadow. I started reading out loud more, sometimes in the evenings, sometimes on stormy afternoons. Old paperbacks I found in boxes in the attic. Stories I hadn't thought about in decades. The dogs didn't care about plot or pacing. They liked the rhythm, the sound of a voice in the room. I tried a few pages of writing, too. Not much, just some cleaned-up entries from the notebook. Typed them out on the old laptop I still had from my last job. It felt strange at first, like I was borrowing someone else's story. But then I realized it didn't need to be polished. It just needed to be real. The following week, a neighbor named Linda stopped by. She'd just adopted a dog from the same shelter, an old lab named Pepper, who had a missing eye and a crooked tail. She brought over banana bread and a leash she didn't need. "I read the article," she said, "and I figured if Carl can do it, maybe I can too." Pepper got along just fine with Barney and Rusty. The four of us sat out on the porch that afternoon. Linda in the rocker, me in the recliner, the dogs sprawled between us. She talked about losing her husband, about how hard the first few months alone had been. "I think I just needed someone to notice the quiet. Pepper does that." I nodded. "So do these two." She looked at me and smiled. "We're not so different from them, are we? We just need a reason to get up in the morning." That night I added her to the notebook too. A new chapter. By the end of the month, we'd finished 3 puzzles, harvested the first cucumbers, and had 2 more letters show up in the mail. One from a teenager who'd convinced his parents to adopt a senior dog, and another from a retired teacher who said reading about Barney and Rusty had helped her reconnect with her estranged daughter. Each one went up on the fridge. One morning, I caught Barney watching me while I trimmed the bushes near the gate. He sat perfectly still, ears perked, tail curled around his side, like he was memorizing the moment. "You're looking at me like you know something I don't," I said. He just blinked slowly and turned toward the garden. I followed him there and sat beside him, staring at the marigolds swaying in the breeze. Rusty joined us a few minutes later, his slow gait familiar now, comforting. The 3 of us sat in the dirt, surrounded by flowers and bees and the hum of summer settling in. I didn't speak. I just listened. To the wind, to the quiet, to the life still moving all around us. And I knew there was still more to come. More mornings, more walks, more tiny moments to collect like fireflies in a jar. Not to keep, just to remember they were there. The dogs didn't need a reason, but somehow they kept giving me one anyway. The last week of June started with heat that pressed down like a heavy coat you couldn't shrug off. The grass turned brittle in patches, and I began watering the garden twice a day just to keep the marigolds from wilting. Barney, ever the sentinel, would follow me out to the beds in the early mornings before the sun had climbed too high, sitting in his usual spot just a few feet away as I knelt in the soil. Rusty had grown more deliberate in his movements, favoring a back leg a bit more than usual, but he still made it a point to nose around the fence line every morning. Even if the world moved slower in the heat, they both kept to their duties like clockwork. I noticed Barney starting to nap more often, his breathing a little heavier, a little more shallow in the afternoons. I wasn't alarmed at first. He was older, and the weather was thick. But by the 3rd day, something told me to watch closer. I adjusted his food, added ice cubes to the water bowls, turned on the extra fan in the living room. He still wagged his tail when I walked by, still followed me room to room, but he seemed to do it from somewhere deeper. Like the engine was still turning, but the fuel was running low. I sat beside him on the porch late that night, the 3 of us soaking in the cooler air after a day that left everything parched. Barney's head rested against my thigh, and Rusty's chin lay across my boot. "You boys ever think about how strange it all is?" I asked. "How one minute you're just trying to stay upright, and the next you're sitting in a garden with a couple of dogs, wondering what it all means?" They didn't respond, of course, but their presence was enough. Always had been. Barney slept late the next morning. I let him. Made his breakfast softer, added warm broth, and carried it to him where he lay near the recliner. He ate slow, but he finished. Rusty stayed near him all day, barely leaving his side. They shared a single patch of rug like they were bound together by something stronger than instinct. That night, I dreamt I was back at the shelter. The day I met Barney. But this time, the room was empty except for him. No cages, no sounds, just him in that same corner. Only when I walked in, he stood right away and came to me, no hesitation. I woke with tears I didn't know I had in me. The next day, he struggled to stand. Not much, just enough to show that something was shifting. I called Dr. Rains and asked if she could come by the house. I didn't want to take him to a cold exam room. She agreed right away. When she arrived, she knelt next to him and spoke softly. Checked his vitals, ran her hand gently down his side. Rusty stood behind her the whole time, watching. She looked up at me and nodded. "He's tired, Carl. More than usual. But he's not in pain. He's just getting ready." I nodded. My throat clenched tight. She left us with some meds to keep him comfortable, just in case, and told me to call if I needed anything. I sat on the floor next to him that evening, same as I had the night I brought him home. I talked like I always did. Told him about the garden, about the new wind chime, about the neighbor's cat who kept trying to sneak through the fence. I told him thank you. And then I said nothing at all for a long time. The next morning, I woke to silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that feels too still. I walked into the living room and saw Rusty curled tight next to Barney, whose chest was rising slow. Too slow. I knelt, placed my hand gently on his side. He opened his eyes just enough to see me. "Hey, buddy," I whispered. "I'm here." He blinked once, then closed them. And just like that, the house was never the same again. We buried him in the garden beneath the marigolds. Jim came to help me dig, silent the whole time. Rusty sat by the fence, watching, not moving. I wrapped Barney in one of the old quilts he'd favored and placed a small wooden marker with his name carved on it at the head of the grave. Nothing fancy, just something to say he was here. After everyone left, I sat out there alone, watched the bees moving from flower to flower, watched the wind stir the petals, and I waited until the sun dipped low and the sky turned soft and blue. Rusty and I moved slower after that. We kept the same routines, mostly. Same walks, same breakfast, same porch time in the evenings. But everything felt just a little quieter. We'd pass by the marigolds, and Rusty would pause, sniff the air, then keep going. Letters kept coming. People who'd followed our story through the Gazette, through the shelter's calendar, through shared posts online. One woman wrote, "I never met Barney, but I feel like I lost a friend." Another read, "Your dog helped me survive this past winter." I taped those up on the fridge with the rest. One afternoon, a girl named Maya from the school program called and asked if we'd come visit during summer sessions. I hesitated, then looked at Rusty, who was curled at my feet, his eyes focused on the door like he was waiting for permission to go. So we went. He wasn't Barney. He didn't roam the room the same way or offer his presence like a gift. But he listened. He let kids read into his ears, trace the soft ridge of his spine, rest their hands on his back while they talked about things they couldn't tell adults. One of them whispered, "You're very soft." And Rusty sighed like that was all the praise he needed. Back home, I found myself reading less and writing more. The notebook grew fuller by the week. Sometimes it was memories. Sometimes it was what-if stories about Barney's first year, what his life might have been before he found me. Sometimes it was just small things, what the porch sounded like in the rain, how Rusty snored differently depending on the weather. Jim helped me build a bench by the marigolds. It wasn't much, just 2 planks, weather-treated, with space underneath where a squirrel could hide if it was brave enough. But I sat there often. One morning, Rusty came out and sat beside me on the bench instead of curling on the grass. I didn't say anything, just rested my hand on his back and looked out across the yard. I stayed in touch with the shelter. Molly invited me to help with their senior adoption program, said it helped having someone who'd lived it. I started coming by once a week, just to talk to potential adopters, to show them that taking in an old dog wasn't about fixing something broken. It was about being willing to sit in the quiet with someone else. One day, I walked into the back kennel and saw a dog curled up in the corner. He looked rough, skin patches, sunken eyes, and when he looked up, I saw it. The same expression Barney had when we first met. Not sadness, not fear, just waiting. I crouched down and said, "Hey, you hungry?" And when he stood, slow but steady, I knew we had room for one more. Rusty sniffed him when we brought him home, circled once, twice, then lay down and went to sleep like he'd already made peace with it. I didn't even have to introduce them. We named him Clyde, because it suited him, because we already had room in the truck for one more name on the list. That evening, I sat at the bench in the garden, 2 dogs at my feet, wind chimes singing softly in the corner. I pulled out the notebook and wrote one last line for the day. Barney saved me. Rusty reminded me how to live. And now, with Clyde, I think we're learning how to begin again. The porch light flicked on behind me. The cicadas started up in the trees, and the dogs leaned into me like they always did when the day ended. And I let it end, knowing the next one would still come, and we'd still be here, waiting for it together.